The blaring alarm gnawed at Commander Jane Wells's fragile awareness, a relentless pulse pounding against her skull. The cryopod's interior was a fog of dim blue light and frost-lined glass, her breath escaping in quick, shallow gasps. The computer's voice cut through her grogginess, cold and mechanical. "Emergency! The UNS Harbinger is off course. Oxygen levels critical. Atmospheric integrity compromised." Jane blinked, her vision blurry, mind sluggish. Cryosleep always left her disoriented. But this was worse. A crawling, visceral panic clawed at her. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. The process was supposed to ease her awake, not yank her out with sirens and dread. The voice continued, monotone but urgent. "Breathing apparatus required. Retrieve device from pod storage before opening the chamber." She fumbled at the pod's side compartment, her fingers stiff, nails scraping against the latch. Her heart raced as her thoughts snapped into focus. No oxygen. The pod walls hissed and creaked, cold metal sweating condensation. Jane's training kicked in. Cryo wake-ups were part of the job. Panic didn't help anyone. She forced herself to breathe slowly, ironically savoring what little air she had, and yanked open the compartment. Inside was the standard-issue breather, a compact device with a transparent mask and a slim tank. Her hands trembled as she fitted the mask to her face, the straps tugging awkwardly at her hair. She twisted the valve, and the mask hissed, the sweet burn of oxygen flooding her senses. Her first deep inhale was sharp, her lungs aching as if they'd been starved for days. Breathing apparatus active, pod door now safe to open. Jane hesitated, her palm hovering over the manual release. She wasn't ready to face what was on the other side. The Harbinger was a state-of-the-art science vessel designed for deep space exploration. It wasn't supposed to fail, not like this. Her fingers curled around the release. She pulled. The pod door hissed open, releasing a puff of freezing vapor. Outside, the corridor was a lifeless expanse of shadow and faint emergency lighting. Frost clung to the walls and ceiling, thin veins of ice spidering along the panels. The air was utterly still, too still, as though the ship itself were holding its breath. The computer voice resumed, more urgent now. "Critical systems offline, navigation error detected, collision imminent in—" The voice garbled, static cutting through. Jane frowned, the distorted sound twisting her gut. Something was wrong with the system's tone, wrong in a way she couldn't quite place. It sounded afraid. She shook off the thought and stepped into the corridor. Her boots echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the eerie quiet. Her breaths, amplified by the breather, became the only steady rhythm in the emptiness. "All right, Harbinger," she muttered, her voice muffled by the mask. "Let's see what mess you've dragged me into." Jane wiped frost from her visor and moved down the cryo bay. Each pod she passed loomed in the dim emergency lighting like a coffin, its frost-glazed surface reflecting her flashlight's beam. One by one, she peered inside, empty. Each pod was open, the interior lids crusted with ice crystals, but no sign of her crew. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry despite the stale, processed air hissing into her mask. Where the hell was everyone? "All right, no time for questions," she muttered, more to steady herself than anything else. "Bridge first, panic later." At the far end of the bay, she located the emergency handle for the door to the main corridor. The control panel was unresponsive, its screen black, so she leaned into the handle and cranked it downward with a grunt. The mechanisms groaned, the door shuddering as it slid open partway, then stuck. Jane pushed through the gap into darkness. The corridor stretched before her like the throat of some great silent beast, the faint red glow of emergency lights barely illuminating the walls. Her breathing quickened as she realized how vulnerable she felt. She turned to an emergency compartment mounted on the wall and flipped it open, finding a sturdy flashlight. Its beam pierced the gloom, casting long shadows along the walls. Her steps echoed softly as she moved forward. The ship creaked faintly, the sound of metal contracting in the cold vacuum of space. She could almost feel the emptiness pressing against the hull, the weight of infinite nothingness beyond. She forced herself to focus. The Harbinger had been on its way back to Earth after a successful mission to Harpocrates, the elusive ninth planet of the solar system. The planet had been a cold, distant enigma for centuries, more myth than fact, until the Harbinger's mission had proved it real. They'd mapped its strange, icy terrain, collected samples from the planet's crust, and discovered something that still made Jane uneasy to think about, an inexplicable energy signature deep beneath the surface. The crew hadn't been able to identify its source, but it was active, vibrant even. Now, the emptiness of the ship and her own creeping sense of wrongness brought those memories flooding back. Something about Harpocrates had felt alive. She shook the thought from her head and pressed on. A glint of metal caught her flashlight's beam. She stopped, frowning. Scratches. Deep gouges marred the corridor walls, each one jagged and purposeful. Her heart skipped as she traced the patterns with her light. They weren't random. They were symbols, circular designs intertwined with jagged lines, spirals feeding into angular shapes. They were crude but deliberate, as if someone, or something, had etched them into the metal with single-minded precision. "What in the hell?" Jane whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. The symbols continued along the corridor walls, leading deeper into the ship. Her instincts screamed to turn back, but she tightened her grip on the flashlight and kept moving. At the far end of the corridor, a faint sound broke the oppressive silence, a distant scraping, like metal being dragged across metal. Jane froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. She raised her flashlight, its beam trembling as she tried to steady her hand. "Hello!" she called, her voice cracking. The scraping stopped. The silence stretched into a taut, unbearable stillness. Jane's pulse hammered in her ears, her grip on the flashlight tightening until her knuckles ached. Then she heard it, soft at first, the rhythmic sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor. Step, step, step. The sound grew louder, the pace quickening. Her breathing hitched as the steps broke into a run, the echoes colliding with the frantic pounding of her heart. "Who's there?" she called, the words barely leaving her mouth before a figure burst from a side corridor, barreling into the dim light. It was George Doncaster, one of the drilling crew, a burly man with a perpetual smirk who had made her laugh more times than she cared to admit during their mission on Harpocrates. But now the smirk was gone, replaced by something primal, grotesque. His face was barely recognizable, his skin marred by deep, dark gouges that looked like self-inflicted wounds. One eye bulged unnaturally, while the other seemed to be missing entirely, replaced by a raw, oozing crater. His white work uniform was stained a sickly brownish red, caked in what could only be dried blood. But it was his movements that sent icy dread clawing up her spine. George didn't move like a man. He jerked and twitched as if his muscles were being tugged by unseen strings, his head snapping back and forth in unnatural spasms. In his right hand, he clutched a heavy drilling tool, a plasma cutter, its jagged edge glinting in the flashlight's beam. "George!" Jane shouted, instinctively stepping back. "What the hell happened? Stand down!" If he heard her, he gave no sign. His one good eye locked onto her, wild and unblinking. He let out a guttural snarl, a sound that barely resembled a human voice, and charged. "Shit!" Jane dove to the side as George swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc. The tool hummed violently as it cleaved through the air, missing her by inches and striking the wall. Sparks erupted as the blade bit into the metal, leaving a glowing, jagged gash. Jane scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as George turned to face her again. His movements were erratic but fast, almost animalistic. There was no recognition in his expression, no trace of the man she knew, only rage, only hunger. "George, stop!" she shouted again, raising her flashlight defensively as she backed down the corridor. "It's me. Commander Wells. You need help, but you have to—" He lunged, cutting her off mid-sentence. She barely had time to react, swinging the flashlight with all her strength. The metal casing connected with the side of his head, the impact reverberating up her arm. George staggered, his head snapping to the side, but he barely slowed down. Not enough. Jane pivoted and bolted down the corridor, adrenaline surging as she sprinted toward the next emergency station. Behind her, she heard his footsteps pounding against the deck, closing the distance fast. "Computer!" she gasped. "Activate internal security. Lock down corridor C5. The voice that responded was cold and detached. "Insufficient power for corridor lockdown. Manual override required." "Damn it!" she spat, glancing over her shoulder. George was gaining on her, his blood-streaked face twisted in a grimace of fury. Ahead, the emergency compartment loomed, its bright yellow handle a beacon of hope in the suffocating dark. Jane dove for it, wrenching it open and grabbing the first thing her hands found, a shock baton. The device was bulky but familiar, its charge indicator glowing a soft blue. She turned just as George lunged again, raising the plasma cutter high above his head. With a desperate cry, she jabbed the baton into his chest and activated it. The corridor erupted in a brilliant arc of electricity, the sharp scent of ozone filling the air. George's body convulsed violently, his snarls turning into a guttural howl as the current surged through him. He collapsed to the deck, twitching, his weapon clattering from his grip. Jane stood over him, her chest heaving, the baton trembling in her hand. She kept it trained on him, waiting for the slightest movement. For a moment all was still. And then George began to laugh. Low and guttural at first, the sound grew louder, more deranged, echoing through the empty corridor like the mockery of a dying god. The laughter was wrong, a sound that curdled the air and clawed at Jane's sanity. George's body convulsed weakly on the deck, his one good eye rolling up to meet hers. Blood bubbled from his cracked lips as he spoke, his voice low and broken, but laced with a terrible certainty. "You're too late," he rasped, his breath hitching between spasms of laughter. "It's already been done." Jane froze, her knuckles white as she gripped the shock baton. "What's been done, George? What the hell are you talking about?" His laughter tapered off into a wet, choking cough. His head lolled to the side, his ruined face twitching as though he wanted to say more. Finally he shuddered, his body going limp. The corridor fell into silence, save for the faint hum of the ship's systems in low-power mode. Jane crouched down cautiously, keeping the baton close. "George," she said almost softly, as if her voice might bring him back from the edge. But his body didn't move, save for the small trickle of blood pooling beneath his ruined mouth. She checked his pulse. Nothing. George Doncaster was dead. Jane sat back on her heels, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a vice. Too late for what? She stared at his lifeless form, the cryptic symbols scratched into the walls now more sinister than before. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what could have happened. The Harbinger had been a tight ship, its crew disciplined, its systems meticulously maintained. The mission to Harpocrates had been strange, yes, but there had been no indication of danger, no sign of this. She thought about the energy readings beneath Harpocrates' surface, the strange anomalies they detected but couldn't explain. "It's already been done," George had said. Her stomach twisted. The sound of distant scraping jolted her back to reality. Jane shot to her feet, her flashlight darting down the corridor. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, metal dragging against metal just like before. And this time, it wasn't alone. The faint cadence of multiple sets of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing steadily louder. Her grip tightened on the shock baton as she backed away from George's body, her flashlight shaking in her trembling hand. She had to move. She needed answers, and they weren't here. "The bridge," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over her own pounding heartbeat. "I need to get to the bridge." She turned and ran, leaving George's body and its unsettling final words behind. But even as she fled, his voice lingered in her mind, a haunting echo that refused to be silenced. "It's already been done.